Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Council of the Americas Democracy Dialogues, a conversation we need to be having now about the state of democracy in the Americas. I'm Eric Farnsworth, your series host. Even as we speak, Russian tanks are sacking Ukraine. The world watches transfixed as an independent, proud, sovereign nation is brought low by the whims and ambitions of one authoritarian leader. Obviously, this has implications for democracy in Europe, but global engagement by authoritarians, whether it be Russia or China or Iran or others, also has implications for emerging markets, including the Americas. As we move deeper into 2022, democracy in the Americas is stressed in many ways. At this point, Democracy Dialogues has been investigating country-specific issues from Venezuela to Nicaragua, Mexico to the Organization of American States. But today we want to take a different look at a topic that has been often discussed but not well understood, which is to say the challenges to Latin American democracy and national security enabled by rapid advances in technology in the hands of authoritarians both within and outside the region. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome a widely sought-after expert on these issues, Dr. Samantha Hoffman, who is the senior analyst with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute Cyber Policy Center. She is an expert on technology, democracy, human rights, and the usage and promotion of advanced tools for authoritarian purposes and ends. Her work particularly explores the domestic and global implications of the Chinese Communist Party's pursuit of artificial intelligence and big data-enabled capabilities to augment political and social control. She's highly credentialed in Chinese language and studies, and her doctorate in politics and international relations is from the University of Nottingham. Dr. Hoffman joins us today virtually from Australia. Samantha, great to have you here with Democracy Dialogues. Thank you for joining us, and apologies for the time of day that it is where you are, but we really appreciate your joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me today.
Well, let's begin, as I mentioned, with the news of the day, which is to say what's going on in Ukraine. And of course, this is not a conversation about that, but we do see a number of things that are happening right now that we might be able to take and learn from in other ways and other parts of the world, etc., an authoritarian's playbook, if you will. What would you think that we should be looking at that might be relevant in the cyberspace scenario, particularly for emerging markets?
Well, I'm not too much of an expert on Russia and Ukraine, so I'll avoid commenting directly there. But I think that the one issue that is overlooked is that oftentimes when we're thinking about technology and authoritarian regimes, we're speaking just about surveillance technologies and the most coercive uses of technologies. And what's often missed in this conversation is the way that technologies that are not necessarily used for coercive purposes, perhaps to solve problems, also help with generation of data collection that could contribute to a number of different sorts of areas that support China's state security. One of the things that I pay attention to in my work is if you take a look at COVID-19, as soon as the pandemic was declared, or around that time, I think it was January 2020, that China activated its national defense mobilization system. And part of that is, information mobilization. So information, so part of that would be economic mobilization. And the kinds of data that China might be able to collect globally and use, so maybe in a crisis that isn't a global public health crisis, but maybe a war, that could have implications for national security globally. So that's thinking far into the future, but those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's go to China, which is more familiar territory for you, and I recognize that. But having said that, you've written eloquently and you've spoken often on the fact that technology is neutral. It can be used for many different purposes, some good, some not so good. So from that perspective, if we say, okay, here's some technology, for Latin America, and we from Washington say you need to be concerned, help us think through why. What's the problem here? Isn't technology a good thing? Don't countries want to increase technology for their own well-being?
Well, I think the issue is really the design of that technology. So technology, I would argue, actually isn't necessarily neutral in terms of who designed it. There's a person behind that. There's a political system that might be so in China, to be more specific, when technology is designed for use in domestic purposes, whether that's like surveillance systems or facial recognition technologies, there's a way of setting standards domestically that involve companies and government research organizations such as the Ministry of Public Security or PLA-linked research organizations, where individuals from each of these places get together and work on developing national standards. And then those standards are expected to be implemented if those technologies are used domestically for domestic purposes. And that would conceivably be the same technology that's exported globally. And obviously, those are designed to meet the needs of the Chinese party state. They aren't just designed for any particular use case per se, even though they could be used in other cases. So I guess that to go back to the question, though, I think that it's not necessarily the end user that we have to be concerned about. Or sorry, it's not necessarily the end user we need to be concerned about. It's also the people who have downstream access to the data that a technology produces, and those could be multiple different organizations. They could be the company that's providing the service, but it could be others who have the access to that data further downstream. And those are the kinds of questions we aren't thinking about, but ultimately can undermine democracy everywhere. So essentially, I think the current processes for doing due diligence around technology aren't necessarily addressing the kinds of problems that we're seeing evolve.
So let's play that out a little bit more. The design matters. It's not just the pure technology. And so let's get specific. If you had a Western designed telecommunications system versus a Chinese developed telecommunications system, and both were bidding on a project in country X in Latin America, what would you say, separate apart from cost and capability, et cetera, to deliver commercially? What would you say would be the difference there to policymakers in Latin America as to why would they be different?
Well, I'd certainly be concerned about no matter who the actor was, what they were doing with the data and who had downstream access. And that goes for Western technology companies as well. But I think that the ultimate difference is who is behind the design and what are the interests. For a Western technology company. Oftentimes those are commercial interests. And so the data might contribute to advertising, for instance. Whereas in China, obviously companies are often acting out of their own commercial interests as well. But there's a different legal system where, say, for the state security law, counter-espionage law, and another suite of data security law, all these security laws that have been passed under Xi Jinping have sort of reinforced. I wouldn't say they aren't new things, but they've reinforced the fact that ultimately it's the CCP leadership in China that has ultimate control over these companies and their activities. And so it means that the I guess the national security risks associated with using them are higher. And obviously, I'm simplifying this a lot for the purpose of a free-flowing conversation. But I'm happy to talk a little bit more about those laws. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about some other things as well.
Well, and we're going to go there in just a second. Let's clarify for those who may not know, CCP is Chinese Communist Party and PLA is People's Liberation Army. But look, I mean, that is relevant for China. why should somebody in Brazil care about that? You know, if the Chinese Communist Party wants to collect data on Chinese people, okay, we might agree with that, we might not agree with it, but at the end of the day, that's what they're doing to their own citizens. If I'm a Latin American, don't I just care about cost and effectiveness in terms of service delivery? I guess what I'm trying to probe is, you know, we hear a lot about threats. We hear a lot about, you know, don't use Huawei technology because you're going to give your intelligence services, you know, over to the Chinese. Is that real, or is that just smoke and mirrors to try to cover up an effort by Western companies for commercial advantage?
Well, it's a great question. I think that one of the problems with the entire discussion on Huawei and other Chinese technology companies is the excessive focus on the intelligence use of the data rather than the multiple uses. And then also when you focus on technology in China being used for coercive purposes and overlook the fact that a lot of technology is also problem solving. So I'll sort of start with that piece, which is that if you look at, say, smart cities in China, you've got technology that is clearly used for more coercive purposes, surveillance technology, tracking particular groups of people, such as Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong, and in particular. But you've also got technology that's solving problems. And those two things aren't mutually exclusive, because problem solving is it's dependent on who's deploying the technology. So problem solving in the CCP's or the Chinese Communist Party's perspective is different than it would be elsewhere. And some of it would be universal, and other things would be specific to that political system. So that's the first thing. But then the second thing that I think is important to think about here is how data, when aggregated, can contribute to an adversary's understanding of a society that they might want to influence. So I did a report in 2019, which I think is still quite relevant today, and it's called Engineering Global Consent, and it's about a Central Propaganda Department controlled company called Global Tone Communications Technology, which is engaged in machine translation services. And that company says that it provides translations in products such as smart conferencing solutions that are offered by Huawei. So their product would, according to their own statements about their activity, is embedded in the Huawei smart conferencing solution. Now, the data that product collects to help provide machine translation will go back to the company that's controlled by the Central Propaganda Department. That company says that its work specifically contributes to China's state security. And in particular, they contribute to a lot of different things, but one of the things they talk about is propaganda work or cultural work. And so you think about data being collected in multiple different languages, the accuracy of the machine translation will become more accurate over time. And so the ability to, and I'll maybe step back and say, I'm tying this to state-funded research in China that looks at doing this exact same thing, which I'm about to describe. But basically, the ability to, say, generate fake news comments underneath news articles in local languages becomes more effective. So basically, the kinds of technologies that are being used, they're the data source for then projecting, say, more effective propaganda over time. And so that's one thing. So then why should a country be concerned? Well, that's undermining democratic discourse in that country. So another thing that I tend to think about is if you're helping to make facial recognition systems more accurate, and the recognition of multiple different face types becomes more accurate over time, whether or not you're deploying that technology in a way that respects basic human rights, another user of that same technology might not be doing the same, and yet you're contributing to the accuracy of that technology. And that's a problem, not just with Chinese technologies, it's a problem more generally, but those are the kinds of conversations I think we should be having as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. In fact, I'm glad you referenced other countries as well. Look, here in the United States, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, just got a lot of public condemnation for employing an outside contractor that was using facial recognition technology for tax returns. And they had to back away from that. So this is real. And it's one of the reasons why I want to explore it. And, trying to figure out, tease out, what are the differences here that we're talking about? I mean, if it's just facial recognition technology, and we just don't like that, okay, that's one thing. Or is it facial recognition technology developed by authoritarian systems versus the same technology or similar developed by Western systems? You see the distinction. Or even further distinction, deployed in authoritarian societies, and in Latin America, that would include countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, full dictatorships, etc. But is it differentiated with democratic societies in Latin America, which is basically all the other countries? So, I mean, there's some really tough nuances here, aren't there?
Yeah, incredibly. I think the main overarching difference is the intent behind the design of the technology. So in China, you've got a very clear intent, which is tied to state security. It's tied to social management. Social management being sort of the party's way of shaping, managing, and controlling Chinese society. But that goes outwards as well in terms of the way that China seeks to shape global public opinion and global affairs in a way that's conducive to the party state's interests. Now, with Western technology companies, I would not be less hesitant in terms of questioning where data is going and how it's being used. I think that's important no matter who's built the technology. I think that the difference is that oftentimes those uses would be more strongly linked to advertising and sort of normal business activity rather than being tied to both normal business activity and authoritarian state interests. And so I think that's, it's a bit of a difficult question to answer, is what's happening to data and how it's being used specifically. But the difference ultimately also is the legal systems that are governing its use. And so if you look at, say, the privacy policies of any technology, so the dash cam on my car would be a South Korean company. It says your data can be collected and sent to servers that are overseas and governed by that law. And so my data would go to South Korea. Chinese technology companies say the same. Your data can go overseas and be stored on our servers in the PRC. But then it wouldn't be accessed unless there's a national security demand for that data. The definition of that is a lot broader in China. And who is a potential criminal? Well, that could be a Hong Kong activist. It could be what's the case of anti-terrorist financing here in Australia, where a Uyghur woman sent her parents money to purchase a home, and according to the reporting, that woman was arrested on charges of terrorist financing, even though she had clearly sent her family money for a home, according to this media report. So I think the definitions of right and wrong are the problem, and how that data can be accessed and abused are different. So they're tough questions to answer.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, look, we're all wrestling with these in some way, but really appreciate your clarification and helping us think through at least some of the questions to ask there. These are tough. Let me also go back to something you were talking about in terms of perfecting the propaganda machine with machine learning and AI through translation services and such. And I think, to go back to where I started the conversation on Ukraine, and I know this isn't a conversation about Ukraine, but one of the things we've seen in real time right now in Latin America is Spanish language media that is essentially parroting the Russian line about what's happening in Ukraine, right? And it's not just Russia Today and Espanol, which is part of it, but it's media services which are picking up the Russian, news services. It's social media. It's YouTube channels which cut and splice and everything. And the point is, those messages don't land effectively if they're not geared toward the local conversation, the local community, obviously the language, effectiveness. So all these things you're talking about, we are seeing it right now in terms of a major country which is involved in military operations against a democratic neighbor, trying to influence global opinion on its side. And one could foresee potentially the same thing. Dare I say it? I hope it never comes to pass, but on something like Taiwan.
Yeah, I think just to sort of think about Chinese propaganda more generally, sometimes I see the conversation going in the direction of, well, the propaganda that you see put in places like Twitter, for instance, isn't very sophisticated. You can see that, say, machine translation was used, and it might not be super effective for reaching a Western audience. First thing I'd argue is that we've seen many cases in liberal democracies domestically recently where you would think messages that would be, sort of not easily believed are believed. So I would argue that actually, the standard isn't necessarily as high as people are sometimes making it. But that being said, I think that the accuracy and the quality over time does increase, and there are many areas where you can look at Chinese propaganda and see the effectiveness. One thing China does, I think, highly effectively is attaching itself to genuine problems, which is something that propaganda does. Effective propaganda does do. So if you think about the way that the CCP would attach itself to anti-Asian racism conversation in the US, a genuine, serious problem, but one that the CCP also tries to attach itself to. And so I think that what we see, just sort of going back to your question, is well, that propaganda apparatus is already pretty effective in places, and making maybe making people think that Hong Kong was all right and there wasn't an emergency until there was. Same in Xinjiang and elsewhere. And so I guess the question is for me, when I look at this, is at what point do you have to worry? And I think that's now. And so, looking at the way that state-funded, my research in GTCOM, you can find these state-funded projects where they're talking about, accessing data in multiple languages and using that for propaganda to push fake news comments. Well, that's a concern, because the technology might not work effectively today, but in 10 years it could, and we can do something about it now. In 10 years we might not be able to.
Yeah, it's a very good warning signal. And I think your point about, frankly, what's happening in Western societies is very relevant too. I mean, we have some real issues in our own societies, and it's easy to point fingers at others, but we also have to clean up some of our own issues, as you rightly pointed to. And throughout these democracy dialogues discussions we've been having, going back to last year, this has been a point that continually comes up. The United States in particular, but others as well. We have to walk the walk as well as talk the talk, as the expression goes. So that's a relevant point. Dr. Hoffman, you mentioned smart cities, and this is relevant particularly in countries like Brazil, but other countries around South America, Mexico City, perhaps, Buenos Aires in Argentina. Smart cities, according to their proponents, are simply the use of technology to help cities work better. Traffic flow, getting ambulances to the right hospitals on time to save lives, better weather management and natural disaster management. What's wrong with that? I mean, why do smart cities, why have they come in for such, the term smart cities come in for such questioning?
Sure. So my first sort of more general response is that sometimes we are looking to use technology and we don't necessarily know what problem we're trying to solve, or if that's technology is the most effective solution. So one example I point to is here in Australia, the use of COVID-19 check-in apps across Australian states and territories. And we didn't have massive outbreaks of COVID here until sort of around our winter last year, was about July last year. And initially, face masks were required for a couple of weeks, and then you were just required to use check-in apps, and then they brought back face masks. And my argument the whole time was why weren't face masks the thing that the government went to first? Because the check-in apps are for contact tracing. The face masks are preventative. And so was technology the right solution in that case? And so I think the first thing with smart cities is that, is the technology really solving problems? Oftentimes it is. Oftentimes technology, and this is in China too, is meant to make processes more efficient, to improve the sharing of information between government entities. That on its own isn't problematic, it's very normal. What's different is where else, well, there's two things. One is the legal system. And so if you're flagged as a car that is being tracked, is that because of who you are and what your politics are? Is that because you were speeding? Are the emergency management systems helping to respond to a natural disaster or a traffic problem, a traffic jam, or are they helping police to cut off access to a particular street for protesters, for instance? I'm trying to think of sort of the dual use, or there are multiple uses for the same thing. And so it depends on both the end user's intent as well as whoever has access to that data, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah, these are tough questions because goodness knows, better traffic flow and more efficient cities, I think, is a good thing across the region.
Universally.
For anybody, universally for sure, including here in Washington, D.C., no doubt. But there are some broader implications. And, the other thing is we've started to see some of this technology, particularly in crowd control and social management, not just exported to countries in Latin America, but some countries like Venezuela have actively used it to oppress their own citizens. So, it's real, and it is being deployed and it is being used against citizens. Of course, Venezuela is no longer a democracy, but it does matter the types of checks and balances and legal regimes that exist in the countries in question. Your points are very, very well made. It gives us a lot to think about. We don't have a lot of time remaining, but let's try to deal with one final question if we can in the last 2 minutes or so. And that is this: if you went to just pick a country, it doesn't matter, country X in Latin America or even the Caribbean, and they were considering couple different systems, one Western-based, one Chinese-based, perhaps. What would be your bottom line? What would you want them to look out for? How could they mitigate risks at the front end so that they don't have some of the problems that we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes that they have to work through and clean up later on?
Well, I think the number one thing that needs to be looked at in more detail, and it's not an easy thing, and this is why I think this is where funding for research should be directed, is really truly understanding the ways that data is collected and used and who has access to it downstream in a company's supply chain. I think that we can do a lot. The end user who's deploying the technology to try to protect privacy, to try to make sure that the technology is only used in a way that meets the legal standards in that country. But at the end of the day, that's only one set of problems. The other set, the one that I focus on in my research, is who else has access to that data and what they might be doing with it that could undermine democracy in that area or elsewhere. And that's where we need a lot more research to help, especially local governments who aren't thinking about these political issues on a daily basis and trying to find the cheapest, most effective solution. That kind of research that would be easy to access is, I think, the most important. And then
It's interesting to hear. It's interesting to hear you talk, and it's consistent with some of the language of the economists who are now considering data as part of national endowments as well. I mean, the importance of data is it's huge already and growing by leaps and bounds all the time. Dr. Hoffman, I think that we have only just started to scratch the surface, certainly of the issues, but also of your expertise. I mean, it's clear that there's a lot more there that I'd love to hear more from you at some point. I hope you'll come back. Regrettably, our time is at an end today, but I want to thank you, first of all, for the work that you're doing. Second of all, for being willing to join us, even virtually from Australia here, for this conversation about a part of the world that maybe folks in Australia don't think of that much, but the fact of the matter is the issues are relevant in emerging markets worldwide, and we do acknowledge that, and we thank you again for that. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to conclude our session of Democracy Dialogues with Dr. Samantha Hoffman. I hope that you will come back for the next one, which we will be announcing shortly as we continue discussing the most pressing and prominent issues about democracy in the Americas. This is Eric Farnsworth. I hope to see you again very soon. Goodbye.